All right, let's turn our attention to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. We got all the way up to verse 17 last week. We talked about Galileo. Gallio, okay. And we talked about all the different things that Paul was facing and how this could have been a really bad situation where he was brought before Gallio and it could have set a precedent that would have affected the rest of his time here. And yet the Lord intervened and Gallio kind of pretty much dismissed the charge completely before Paul even had to defend himself. And so we see them jump on Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue. They beat him up. And then there's this it's like well, then there was that. Anyway, and it's just this really kind of odd move on period where we go from 17 to 18. But let's read 18 through 23. So again, we go from they beat him up in front of the bench, but nothing concerned Gallio, to so Paul, having stayed on for many days, said goodbye to the brothers and sailed away to Syria. Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He shaved his head at Cenchrea because he had taken a vow. When they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and engaged in discussion with the Jews. And though they asked him to stay for a longer time, he declined, but said goodbye and stated, "I'll come back to you again if God wills." Then he set sail from Ephesus. On landing in Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he set out and traveled through one place after another in the Galatian territory and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Now, so he spends a good while in Corinth. We don't know exactly how long, a pretty good while. And this basically is the end of his second missionary journey. So he's completed journey 1, he's completed journey 2, and he sails away to Syria, returning back to his sending church, which is Antioch. And this time, though, he goes back to his sending church, but he brings this new missionary couple. It's really an interesting dynamic that he goes out alone and he runs into these people. God organizes and sets up their meeting at Corinth, and they have some similarities. They work in the same field. They strike up a conversation, and then they end up coming to be, really integral to what he's doing with the ministry. And so they come back to Antioch with him, and they come into Cenchrea, which is a small seaport just east of Corinth, which would actually later be the site of a church. We see that in Romans 16:1, where he says, "I commend our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea." So before leaving port, he shaves his head. And now, if you don't know anything about what's going on, it would be kind of odd when you just read that he shaved his head. He shaved his head because he had taken a vow. What does that mean? What kind of vow would cause you to shave your head? Well, take you back to Numbers chapter 6. There's a little bit of speculation about exactly what's going on here, but most commentaries believe that he is following a Nazirite vow, Numbers 6. The Nazirite vow would be basically 30 days. You would be no meat, no wine, no haircut. But the difference is, most of the time what I've seen is you shave your head at the end of the Nazirite vow, but here he shaved it at the beginning. So that's what kind of causes a little bit of maybe a confusion or some doubt. I just think that what he did was shave it at the front end and then shave it again at the end. Maybe, we don't know that, but that's kind of the way I look at it. There's a long passage here from an article from David Guzik. And y'all know I hate to read long things because it's hard to listen to somebody just read over and over. But this is so good. I want to try to give you this. It says, Paul's performance of this vow shows that the Jewish opposition to his preaching had not made him anti-Jewish. Now, pause. I'm going to read the rest of his thing, but that's an amazing statement. And again, it reveals what I have said time and time again, that Paul is not leaving Judaism. In his mind, what he is doing is not rebuffing Judaism. It's not dismissing Judaism. He, in his mind, I believe, and I think this is further proof of that, is taking the next logical step of Judaism. He's saying we have looked for Messiah. That's part of what being a good Jew is, and I have found the Messiah. And so in being a good Jew, we are now going to worship the Messiah. And even though the Jews had come against him for a long time now in a lot of different places. It wasn't like, yeah, I went to this one place and they didn't like me, so I went somewhere else. You know, I kind of feel like I can relate to Paul. Everywhere I go, I find people that don't like me. And maybe that was a little bit too close to the truth to be a joke. I really wish y'all had laughed. Just kidding. So here, Guzik goes on. He says, he never forgot that he was Jewish. Now listen to this. He never forgot that he was Jewish. His Messiah was Jewish, that Christianity is Jewish, and that Old Testament forms and rituals might still be used to good purpose. Now again, Paul, being a good Jew, is going to the synagogues to take Jesus to the Jews. Why? Because they're the first ones it's for. Romans 1:16. Paul said, unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's the power of God to salvation, to the Jew first and then to the Greek, or to the Gentile. So he knows that the gospel is primarily first and foremost to the Jews. But he also knows that it's easier for him to explain Jesus to a Jewish audience because he can go to the Old Testament. He can say, remember Genesis 3:15? They wouldn't have numbers back then, but he would give them the verse. You will bruise his head, he will bruise your heel. That's talking about the Messiah. He can walk them through the Levitical system. He can show them how all the sacrifices and festivals are pointing to the finished work of Christ. So that's what he does. He sees an opportunity to reach his people, the Jewish people, with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he never considers himself to be not Jewish. He considers himself to be primarily of Christ. He's a servant of Christ. He's a slave, a doulos of Christ. But he never considers himself to have broken away from his Jewish roots. He's taking the next logical step. Guzik goes on. Apparently, though Paul was adamant that Jewish ceremonies and rituals not be required of Gentiles, he saw nothing wrong with Jewish believers who wished to observe such ceremonies. Presumably, in their fulfillment in Jesus was also, if their fulfillment in Jesus was also recognized. Perhaps the intense worldliness of Corinth made Paul want to express his dedication and separation to the Lord more than ever. Paul's adoption of the vow out of bounds, dictated by Jewish tradition, could indicate a desire to practice a more purely biblical observance of Jewish rituals. I think that's a great point that Guzik makes there, is that Paul has been immersed in this immorality, this ickiness, if you will, and he's feeling it. He's feeling the pressure of it. He's feeling the dirt on his skin a little bit. Does that make sense? And so he's like, hey, I'm going to go back to what I know. I'm going to do this vow. And it's just going to be an outward sign of something that I want God to do on the inside. And I'm going to do this vow, and I'm going to take this through. It also could have been that he was preparing to go back to the Jewish church. He knew that the Christian church in Jerusalem would be primarily Jewish, and so he's going back there, and he's like, what better way to go back than in a Nazirite vow? Maybe that will help me endear myself more to them and help them connect more with me, so that'll make me able to share the gospel more. Remember, Paul is the one who said, I have become all things to all people so that I may by any means reach some. Now, that should challenge us a little bit. That should kind of push us a little bit to think about in what ways are we holding on to our own culture or our own opinions or our own, whatever, traditions in a way that would keep me from taking hold of the cross, in a way that would keep me from doing what Paul did, which is to try to be all things to all people. I want to make sure that I don't burn a bridge before I get to go across that bridge and tell somebody about Jesus. And that's kind of the mindset that I think he's taking on. In verse 19, he talks about going to Ephesus. This was a city on the west coast of Asia Minor, which would be modern-day Turkey. And it was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. Had a little over, somewhere around 250,000 people in its city. And this is actually the first church congregation mentioned in the 7 letters to the churches in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Now think about that. Upon arriving in Ephesus, Paul left Priscilla and Aquila outside and went to the synagogue to debate the Jews. This city was challenging. This city, the city of Ephesus, was difficult. It was hard work. It was labor-intensive ministry. You don't believe me? Listen to this. 1 Corinthians 15:32. Paul says, if I fought wild beasts in Ephesus as a mere man, what good did that do me? Now, he's obviously not talking about literal wild beasts. He's talking about the battle that it was to try to win souls, win hearts for Christ. It's the battle of going against the adversary and his forces that were trying to stop him in Ephesus. He recognized the difficulty in Ephesus, and yet it became a congregation that was first mentioned when John saw his vision and Jesus was sending letters to the 7 churches. By the way, you do know that if Paul was writing, or if Jesus was writing new letters now, we'd be getting one, right? And it wouldn't be pretty. So remember that Paul wanted to come preach here some 2 years earlier, but he was held back. He was not allowed to do that by the Holy Spirit. Back up a couple chapters, Acts 16:6. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia. They had been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And so this is a good reminder that sometimes God's answer is not yet. We always want God to answer our prayer with yes, but he doesn't work that way. It's always either yes, no, or not yet. Our problem is we only want one of those 3 answers. And we're only going to be satisfied with one of those 3 answers, but look what God did. Who knows? All right, I'm going to get into some challenging stuff here. I don't want to, but that's kind of where I feel like we need to go. Every time something bad happens to somebody, I have these conversations almost every time with somebody. Why would this happen? I don't understand why this. What good could come from this? I don't understand. I thought this was going to go this way. It went that way. I was trying to do the right thing, and it feels like that God's not letting me do the right thing. I'm in touch with those emotions. I have said those same things. And by the way, just to be fair, I may say them again in a month or two, in 6 months, in a year. I may run into a situation where I'm going, all right, God, what in the world are you doing, man? You fumbled this whole thing. You've messed this whole thing up. This is how this should have gone. I can see where you would get glory through doing this. I'm trying to do what I think you want me to do, and you're not letting me, and I'm going to get mad, and I'm going to get frustrated. Well, when we do that, we need to think back to this. About 2 years prior to this point, God wanted to come here, and Paul wanted to come here, and God told him no. Now, Paul could have said, well, if I ain't going to Asia, I ain't going nowhere. How many of y'all can see you doing that? I'm going to raise my hand real high because I can see me doing that. Lord, I feel like you're calling me here, and I'm going to go there. And he goes, nope. And I'm like, well, I'm just not going to go anywhere. Y'all do know what we sound like when we do that, don't you? Sound like a little kid, like a little toddler. Paul wanted to go 2 years earlier. God said no. 2 years later, God says, hey, go to Ephesus. And it turns out to be a congregation that sticks around, that has impact. What if Paul had gone 2 years earlier? Maybe God knew something. Now, just go with me here. Maybe God knows something that Paul doesn't know about timing. Maybe God knows that if Paul had gone 2 years earlier, Paul would have been tortured. Maybe he knows that 2 years earlier there wouldn't have been any presence, and he would have gone and it would have been fruitless. It would have been nothing but disappointment and disarray. What if God knew that he hadn't yet met Priscilla and Aquila, who would be necessary and helpful for him to go to Ephesus, for them to be with him? You see, here's the thing I want you to understand, church. God, go with me, don't panic here. God knows more than you do. Some of y'all are shocked by that, I think. God knows more than you do. He knows more than I do. He knows more than the highest ranking official in our government knows. I'm not sure who that is right now, but whoever they are. Sorry, that was too easy. Listen, God knows when is the right time for you to do this or that or the other thing, or whether or not it's the right thing for you to do ever. Well, God, I have my heart set on this boy, and he won't go out with me, and God knows better than you do. Move on, sister. Oh, man, God, I really wanted this job, and it would be perfect. It's in the great city, and it says the money's good, and God doesn't let me have that job, and I don't know what God's doing. God knows better than you. Keep putting your resume out there. I'm going to go one step further. Y'all listen to me. Sometimes maybe God just wants you to be faithful. Even when we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Maybe sometimes God withholds from you because you're getting a little too sassy. You're starting to think that you don't need him. And let me tell you something, that's a dangerous place to be. When you start thinking that you know better than him and you don't need him, that is a dangerous place to be. And so maybe God says, hold on just a minute. Maybe God has something better that you can't see. My point is this: if Paul had gone against what God had wanted, who knows what would have turned out in Ephesus. But when God said no, Paul said, okay. If you won't let me go there, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. Here's what I always tell people. People all the time, especially younger people in ministry and stuff, and they're like, how do you know when it's time to go? And how do you know when God's calling you somewhere else? And how do you know what to do? And here's what I always tell them. Do the last thing that you know God told you to do until you know he's told you to do something else. And by the way, if you're wondering about it, whether or not you should stay in your marriage and be faithful to your spouse, God told you to do that. When you committed to that, when you said those vows, you stay there and you be faithful. Pastor, you don't understand what I'm getting. Stay there and be faithful. Now, if there's physical abuse, that's different. But you stay there and be faithful. Trust the Lord. And if you need to get some of us to come out there and tune somebody up, ladies, y'all call us up. Y'all don't realize how close I am to starting a tune-up ministry in our men's ministry. Y'all have no idea. I'm praying about it. Some of y'all better be worried about that. I'm asking the Lord to give me the go-ahead on that. He green lights that, baby. We coming. Be faithful. Trust the Lord. Exercise that muscle called faith. Stop pouting like a toddler when you don't get your way, and just know that if you didn't get your way, trust his way. Maybe his way is better than your way, and he's trying to get you to understand that, and you're too thick-headed to understand it any other way for him to just go, nope. You ever done that with your kid when they were little? I saw Allison back there nodding. Sometimes, look, you're littler than I am. I'm just going to pick. Nope, you can't do that. And sometimes God has to do that with me. Praise the Lord. Look at verse 20 and 21. So they wanted Paul to stay longer, but he didn't feel like it was time to stay longer. And so what does he say? He says, I'll come back and see you again. But then there's a caveat there. What's that caveat? If God wills. Some translations of verse 21 read this way: by all means, it is necessary to keep the coming festival in Jerusalem, but I'll come back to you again if God wills. This would be because the Nazirite vow is going on, and Paul would need to return to Jerusalem for the upcoming festival to present an offering which would complete the vow. So that's partly what we could see here. The principle, though, that I want you to understand is bigger than that. Paul doesn't, and this is a learning process, again, that we see Paul going through because of, I think, the last 2 years, because he wanted to go there and God wouldn't let him. He went somewhere else. He saw God do some amazing things. Yeah, he went through some stuff, but he saw God do some amazing things. There's another little life lesson there. Sometimes you're going to have to go through the briars to get to the berries. You just got to just keep doing what you're doing. Again, when you know God's told you to do something, difficulty, disagreement, discontentment, disjointedness shouldn't stop you from doing what God's called you to do. Paul had seen the hand of God on his life. Paul had seen the work of God in synagogues and street corners and in Athens and Corinth and all these other places. And so he knows God has a better plan. So he says, I will come back to you if God wills. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. James says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city, spend a year there, and do business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring or what your life will be. For you're like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. Now, I'm not here to tell you that people are being unspiritual when they say, hey, I'll come back tomorrow and finish that up. Or, hey, we're going to have to move that meeting to next Thursday. But I want to emphasize this. Even if it's not vocal, even if it's not verbal, we say it, in our minds, every plan we make needs to have this caveat on it. I'm going to go do fill in the blank if God wills. Now I say that because for this simple reason. If you start conditioning yourself to make your plans if God wills, I'm convinced it will help you make your plans in accordance with God's will. It's a simple thing to just start. And again, listen, don't do that thing. We do that thing sometimes where we start saying it every time, and then it just gets to be kind of a biff. You're like, oh, I know. It's understood. It's okay for things to be understood. But I really want us to start conditioning ourselves that in our minds we say, hey, Julie, remind me tomorrow to do fill in the blank. And in my mind, I think, if God will. Hey, Dustin, let's go do this. Let's a couple weeks from now when the fishing gets good, let's go fishing. And in the back of my mind, I think to myself, if God wills. If we will start just conditioning ourselves to think it, again, you don't have to say it, because again, you're going to drive people nuts. If you're that guy that everything they say and say, hey, I'll see you tomorrow, and you go, if God wills, they're like, never mind, I don't think the Lord wills for me to see you tomorrow. But like if we just start thinking that way, that every plan we make, every thought we have, every goal we set, if it is the will of God, I'll do this, or I want to do this, I want to aim for this, but I don't want to miss the will of God in what I'm aiming to do, what I'm trying to do, what I'm thinking about doing, what I'm planning to do. I want to make sure that I'm putting the will of God first. When we start to think that way, I think we'll start to live that way. As a man thinks, so he is. I think if we'll start thinking about, I want to do this, but I only want to do it if it's God's will. I want to plan to do this, but I want God's will to supersede my plans. I think it'll help us. Paul would return to Ephesus later, and it would be a major focus of his third missionary journey because God willed. Now look at 22 and 23. It says he came to Caesarea, went down to Jerusalem, and met with the church in Jerusalem before going back down to his home church in Syrian Antioch about 3 years after he had begun this journey. Now think about this. This is a long, we should have had that picture. I should have had that whole picture is kind of cool. To look at all that whole second missionary journey was a haul. Man, that's a long way. When you consider they didn't have motorboats and buses and Ubers and they didn't have bicycles. I mean, it was lefty and righty, or you maybe riding a camel or some kind of a sailboat or a little small skiff. This is a long way to go. And it took him 3 years to make this journey from Antioch, Syrian Antioch, all the way back around to where he was going and back to Syrian Antioch. So he spent some time there in Antioch, and then he traveled around the region of Galatia and Phrygia. And here's what it says he was doing. And I love this. It says he was strengthening all the disciples. Let's flip back to 14:22. It says, back to 21. After they'd evangelized that town and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch, strengthening the hearts of the disciples by encouraging them to continue the faith, by telling them it is necessary to pass through many troubles on our way to the kingdom of God. So just as he had done before in chapter 14, he does it again in chapter 16. And what is he doing? He is continuing the work of disciple making. It's really kind of becoming a pet peeve of mine. And I honestly, I think that's kind of why we see some of this burning out in the church today. When I grew up, man, we had revivals 2 or 3 times a year. Some guy would come from out of town, he'd blow in, he'd blow up, and he'd blow out. And he'd get everybody stirred up, fired up, and you'd be ready to take on hell with a water pistol. And then he'd pack all his stuff up and go. And now, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but go with me. Some of y'all are already getting mad. Stay with me. I like revivals. That's fine. Here's the problem. The local church did a terrible job of stoking the fire that had been lit when the preacher came in and burned everybody's house down. He came in and just blew everybody away and then left, and we went, all right, wasn't that good? All right, back to life as usual. Now, we're getting into some dangerous ground here, but here we go. If that worked, the American church would not be in the shape it's in today. By and large, and I don't think anybody can argue with this, by and large, the American church is apathetic or just plain old pathetic. We're not packed. We're not full of soul winners. We're not full of generous givers. We're not full of disciple makers. We have still most, and again, listen, I'm not throwing stones at you. I'm talking about church big C across the country, American church. Most churches are struggling to find people to step into leadership roles, to teach. We've got, I was reading something the other day that, and I don't remember the exact number. Somebody may have seen this and can help me. It was talking about that public confidence is at an all-time low for clergy. Does anybody remember seeing that? Do you remember who else was in the, I can't remember who else was in the grouping now where we are, clergy. But I remember one of them, it was politicians. I think lawyers was in there too. And I'm like, man. Do what? It was nurses, wasn't it? Yeah, not even, doctors were in there. Doctors down there with us. Nurses are up here. Me and doctors are down here. It shouldn't be that way. But it is that way. Why? Because people are stupid. By the way, just don't ever let that little factoid leave your brain, because it'll cause you to get disappointed real quick. People are stupid. They do stupid things. We're made of flesh. We're human just like anybody else. Listen, I know guys who have been in ministry and who have just completely spit the bit. I mean, just messed up, disqualified themselves, and I would say they could never step back into a pulpit if it was up to me. I know other guys who have worked diligently, served well, and been sheep bit to the point that they ain't worth knocking in the head. And they go away. Both of those situations cause a lack of trust. They don't give the person the benefit of the doubt that worked themselves half to death and got ground into powder by this mean-spirited church. They just throw them aside with these other guys who deserve to be ignored, deserve to be distrusted. We've got a heart problem in the ministry. We've got a confidence problem in the church. And we've got to build that back. And it doesn't happen with revival preachers coming in, screaming and shouting and leaving, and then there's no discipleship. That's the thing about the man church that I've heard Rick Burgess say hundreds of times. You have all these big events, it gets all this rah-rah, and everybody comes in, it's yay! And then they go back to their church, and it's dead. It's just stagnant water. Nobody wants to pour into them. Nobody's got time to mentor them. Men don't act, by the way, men, can y'all please help me with this? I'm as bad as y'all are. I understand we don't like to ask for directions, and we got Google Maps and stuff now. We don't have to ask for directions, but you can at least start asking for help. I'm going to be honest with you. If you think you're going to go through this life and never need any help, you're a bonehead. And if you think that everybody believes that you don't need any help, you're a bigger bonehead. Can I give you some comfort tonight, men? These ladies know we need help. Other men know you need help. The reason other men don't call you on the fact that they know you need help is because they don't want nobody to think that they need help. It's a vicious circle. It's a dog biting his own tail. We've got to get out of our own way. We've got to start having discipleship here for men, for women, for kids. For way too long, the church has focused on babies and kids and youth. And then when you get out of youth, good luck, God bless you. We'll see you when you get married and have kids and you come back, and then we're going to make you a deacon and a team committee member. And we've got to disciple from listen, Tammy's discipling those little babies back there. Kendra is up there in Awana right now, and some of the godless people I know that are up there right now serving in Awana. I mean, it's not always peaches and ice cream up there with those kids on Wednesday nights. There's some people up there serving hard on Wednesday night, loving on some kids, discipling those kids. Austin and some of our college students and other volunteers and adults, teachers are discipling up there in our student ministry. We have men's and women. We have women's D groups going on right now where ladies are discipling and encouraging other ladies. We have men's groups. We have a men's group on Tuesday morning here, Tuesday night at Jeremy Gibbs' house. Sunday night we got 2 of them that meet here. If you're not being discipled, everybody look at me. It's your fault. Preacher, I ain't got time. I'm in one. I don't need discipleship. Well, I do. If you're farther ahead than I am, come see me. Where we're going to build trust, where we're going to build the church is in discipleship, intentional. Listen, I'm talking about get your hands dirty discipleship. Digging in the dirt, planting seeds, fertilizing, watering, encouraging, talking about your problems, sharing your struggles, being encouraged. We need discipleship. If revival, blow in, blow up, blow out was working, the American church would be thriving. It's not. It's scuffling. It's struggling. I forgot the statistics of how many ministers leave the ministry every year. How many churches close every year. And y'all have heard me say it before, and I'll say it again for the record. The worst thing in the world is not that somebody would leave the ministry and not that a church would close. It's that somebody unqualified would stay in the ministry and some mean-spirited, hateful church would stay open and keep grinding people into dust and giving a bad name to the cause of Christ. But if churches are going to close, we have to start being willing to bring people in, to welcome people in, to go out and get people, go out and invite people, bring them in, show them Jesus, disciple them, encourage them, point them to Christ and walk with them in His direction. That's what Paul did. When it says strengthening all the disciples, that's the other part of evangelism. It's a good reminder that making converts is not the end of the work. It's the beginning of the work. It has to go further. It has to be more extensive. God did not call us to go make professors. He did not say, go into all the nations, baptizing, teach them all that I've observed you to. He didn't do all of that so that we could get people to say, raise your hand if you want. I see that hand. I see that hand. I've heard people even say this, you don't have to come forward. You've got, now listen, don't misunderstand me. You don't have to walk forward. Walking forward doesn't save you. But if you're truly confessing Christ, you should want people to know about it. There are no Secret Service Christians in a free country like this. If you're a follower of Jesus, everybody ought to know it. And I want you to hear me. If everybody around you doesn't know that you follow Jesus, maybe you don't follow Jesus the way you should. Maybe you keep using that word and it doesn't mean what you think it means. We have got to stop coddling and covering over and making people feel good about themselves and trying to avoid conviction, because that's not helpful. But we've also got to stop with this, well, they made a profession, I'm done. Your profession of faith is the starting line, not the finish line. I've put my faith in Jesus. Praise God. Let's get you in a D group. Let's get you in a small group. Let's get you somebody that will be your accountability partner. You know why churches don't do that? Because it's hard. It is hard. It's frustrating. You know why? Because we're people, and people are hard and frustrating. If you don't believe me, you don't know enough people. But that's the work. The Great Commission is not just evangelism, it's also discipleship, and the two go hand in glove. You evangelize, you share the gospel, you tell them about Jesus. They make a profession of faith, and you say, come on now, let's get in here with me, and we're going to keep walking with Jesus. We're going to get closer to Jesus. We're going to study the Bible together. We're going to talk about our lives together. We're going to pray together. We're going to encourage one another. We're going to hold each other accountable. You know why I believe that accountability is not popular? It's not because people don't want to hold other people accountable. They're afraid that if they hold them accountable, somebody's going to do that to them, and they don't want no part of that. No. I'll hold you accountable. Don't you talk about my stuff. We've got to get out of that mindset, y'all. The American church has got to get out of that mindset. We've got to, look, we're all messed up. I mean, like a football bat. We are messed up. like a soup sandwich. We are messed up. And the quicker we recognize that and admit that to each other, the better off we're going to be. When you realize that I'm messed up and I know that you're messed up, then we can get together and we can get our stuff going. We can get ourselves out of the ditch. Strengthening all the disciples really is what we should be about as a church. It's what each one of us should be about as a follower of Jesus. If you're following Jesus and you're not trying to gain other followers of Jesus, how selfish can you be? Oh, Brother Kevin, I'm just trying to get my... Okay, good. We'll finish. That ought to take you a couple weeks. And then you need to get somebody else. By the way, no matter where you are in the lifetime, in the lifespan, life cycle of a believer, if you're a brand new believer, give it about 2 weeks and find somebody who just came to Christ. You got 2 weeks on them. Bring them along. You've been following Jesus for 90 years? Good. Find somebody new. Listen, discipleship is a lifelong thing. You ought to always be thinking about looking for ways that you can help disciple. That's one of the beautiful things about the church, especially when I look at us in here. We're a multi-generational church. I wish we were more multi-ethnic because I think all of the different ethnicities have stuff we can encourage and help each other with. But at least we're multi-generational. So you got some older adults in here who have seen stuff. They're like Farmers Insurance. You know, they know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two. And I need those men and those women in my life so I can go to them and say, hey, I'm going through something. I need somebody to help me. No offense, but I'm not going to a 25-year-old. If I'm going through something with my wife and my kids, there may be some 25-year-olds that have enough life experience to help me, but I can bet you anything that if they got a little snow on the roof or maybe they done got the sunroof opened up there, they probably got a little bit more mileage on them and they might can give me some more wisdom and insight. That's how God set it up. Little kids all the way up to older adults, and we can all learn from each other. We can all encourage each other. Some of these senior adults need some help with their phones. And get some of these young people to go, I tell you what, you help me with this problem in my life and I'll set your phone up for you so you don't, so you actually find your emails. Y'all, this is nearly 2,000 years ago, what we're reading about. Now think about this. This is 1,800 years ago, 1,900 years ago. And they're going through some of the same exact stuff we're going through. Yeah, our technology is different, our circumstances are different, but we're not that different. People are always going to be people. People have always been people. And until Jesus comes back and makes us without flesh, we're going to continue to be people. When Paul says, I need to go spend some time. Now, listen, Paul is part circuit rider. Those of you that know the old evangelism stuff and revival stuff understand what that means. That's what they used to call those guys. They call them circuit riders. Because they just get out there and they go from church to church. Again, blow in, blow up, blow out. Get back on the horse, ride a little further, jump off. So Paul was part that, and he was part church planter, and he was part mission strategist, and he was part missionary, and he was a lot pastor. You see the pastoral heart that Paul had. It's shocking sometimes to have a heart as big as Paul's for these many churches and people. But he was a mixture of all of that. And why? Because he needed it. But he still recognized, even though, there's a lot more fun, I think, in circuit riding. I'll be honest with you, it would be fun to be able to be a revival preacher where you ain't got to worry about the mess you make. You ain't going to be there Monday to meet with nobody to chew you out. You just come in there and you pull the pin on that grenade and you toss it in the middle of the church and you say a prayer at the end and you leave. But Paul understood that that was not all that was required. He understood that there was a follow-up to that ministry. He would go in, he would go to the synagogues and he would tell about Jesus. And he would go to the street corners and to the markets and to the Areopagus and he would tell about Jesus. And he would move on and move on and move on. But then he would say, hey, whoa, I need to go back and I need to do some follow-up work. I need to do some encouraging. I need to do some discipling. Hey, where are you at? Okay, good, that's good. You're doing well. Let's take another step forward. And he always understood it with a caveat that it would be if the Lord wills. Now, we'll close there. We'll pick up with Apollos next week. But I want to give you like a little spoiler. Apart from the return of Christ, apart from the rapture or the end of time, whatever you want to call it, here's what I know God wills. I don't know whether or not God wills for you to go do such and such or buy and sell and make a profit, as James talked about. I don't know that. I don't know if he wants you to go fishing or hunting or go to the ball game or I don't know any of that. All right? You can plan those things, put that little caveat if the Lord wills. Here is what I am convinced of beyond a shadow of a doubt. Here's what I know the Lord wills for your life. That you would walk closer to Christ, that you would study the Word and know Christ more intimately, that you would reflect Christ properly, and that you would share Christ continually. I am convinced of those things. You cannot turn me to the right or to the left. I'm convinced of those things. So when you're thinking, should I witness to my neighbor? Yes. You don't have to say if the Lord wills. You can say, as soon as I get an opportunity. If you're asking, should I start praying with my family? Should I start leading my family in some kind of little devotional time? Absolutely, yes. Yes. I solve that question for you. You ain't even got to worry about it. And you don't even got to pray about it. I guarantee you that's what he's wanting you to do. Should I love my spouse more? Yes. Should I love and encourage my kids more? Yes. Should I study the Bible more? Yes. All this other stuff that sometimes we let get in the way of those primary things, they're just distractions, y'all. They can be good distractions. I mean, your kid playing Little League or cheering or you're volunteering at the soup kitchen or whatever, man, that's good stuff. But it's not primary. And here I go. I feel like I'm going to be a broken record again. But y'all, I'm a simplistic thinker. And to me, the most obvious thing is that he has called us to love God, love people, and make disciples. That's it. Love God, love people, make disciples. There's a lot of other stuff, but there's nothing more than that. There's nothing less than that, I should say. So before you start trying to worry about should I go on a mission trip or should I plant a church or should I do this or do that, are you loving God? Are you loving others? Are you making disciples? And by disciple making, I mean evangelizing. Look for opportunities. When you see somebody struggling, man, talk to them. It's amazing how many times in restaurants when I would just tell the waitress, hey, we're about to bless the food. I'm going to say a prayer over our food. Is there anything I can pray for you about? You know, you'd be amazed how many times they tear up. And they'll share something. Yeah, my mother's sick, or yeah, my dad just had surgery, or yeah, I need some direction. Listen, if you don't believe that the world is lost and dying and hungry for truth, just go watch some of the craziness that's going on. There are people who are desperately looking for truth, and they're looking everywhere but us. You know why? Because we've lost our credibility. We've got to get back to who we are. We've got to get back to who Christ has called us to be, who he's made us to be, and we've got to start being salt and light. Salt and light means we've got to be difference makers. We've got to be culture influencers. We've got to be thermostats, not thermometers. Love God, love others, make disciples. Everything else is commercials. Paul knew it. Paul lived it. So should we. Let's pray. Father, you are great and greatly to be praised. And I thank you for your word. Lord, I'm just always astounded at how convicting it can be. I can't even imagine. I can't think about how many times I've read Acts 18. I can't even begin to think about how many times I've read it. And yet every time I read it, I'm still convinced that there's somewhere that I can improve. There's some place that I'm missing you, that I'm falling short. God, your word really is sharper than any two-edged sword. It cuts so deep. It helps us remember who we are, whose we are, that we are sinful, that we are fallen, and that we desperately need your Holy Spirit to give us guidance. God, help us all. Again, Lord, start with me. I never pray a prayer for anybody to improve or draw closer to you before I ask you to start with me. So, Lord, help me to be better. Help me to be more like Jesus. Help me to be more on task and on mission. I want to see you do amazing things in our church, in our community, our state, our nation, our world. But it's never going to happen unless it starts with us. So, God, I pray that you would revive each one of us. I pray that you would stir each one of us to have a deeper conviction for doing those three things that are clear, plain, obvious, irrefutable. To love you, to love others, and to make disciples. Give us the burden, give us the burning desire to do that. God, help us to submit ourselves more fully to your will every single day. And then, God, I pray that you would multiply our efforts. Lord, I know that when we do our part, when we serve you, when we just give our part, you can do exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or imagine. And that's what we want to see. So, God, help us. Help us to have that consistency of faithfulness, that consistency of truth-seeking. God, to be who you've called us to be, to let the world see the love of Christ in us. And God, help us to point them to you. God, thank you again for this time that we've got to lift prayer needs and discuss things. Thank you for this time in your word. Thank you for these amazing people that are part of my family here at Westmobile. God, I pray you would bless them. I pray you would guide them and strengthen them. Lord, bring us back Sunday to worship you in spirit and in truth if you delay. And we'll give you the praise in Christ's name. Amen. God bless you, church.